let's watch. This is how I want to build socialism from our old buddy Vaush. So, like I've said with this video, this is basically Vaush explaining his path to socialism. So this isn't like the most controversial video he's made by any means, but I think there's a lot in this video that kind of shows the problem with these sort of like bread tube debate bro type characters who are calling themselves socialists while oftentimes repeating the same lines as the U.S. State Department and repeating imperialist propaganda without thinking about it critically. I think we could see a lot of the fault in their principles and in their theoretical understanding of capitalism in this video. So let's watch it, and we're going to watch Vaush talk about how he wants to build socialism while drawing on MS Paint. Let's run it.
I'm sure most of you guys have probably seen by now the video that I did on Joshua Collins and some of the disappointment that I felt when it seemed as though he didn't know what the fuck he was doing when it came to electoral efficacy. And it made me think, like, I still haven't actually done any videos on how I want to establish socialism in the United States. And a lot of people have criticized me for that. And I keep saying, I'll get to it. Like, what would you do? Like, what's your actual game plan, you know? A lot of people, Destiny criticized me for this too. Destiny criticized me. Like, you want to talk about, like, this society, you want to talk about what's here, but you can't talk about how to get to that point, okay? So I want to talk about that, all right? I'm going to try and keep this as expedient.
Before Marx, sorry, I had my mic off. A lot of people before Marx had utopian ideas of socialism. People like Fourier or people like Robert Owen. And they were like, capitalism is really messed up. It exploits the shit out of the working class at the behest of the capitalist class. We need to create a different kind of society. And Robert Owen actually tried to create his own sort of utopian socialist society, sort of like a worker-owned co-op type deal. And Marx liked these utopian socialists, right? He said they had the right idea. But what actually needs to be done is a systematic analysis of capitalism which shows us the class forces and class antagonisms at play. And that can show us how to actually get to socialism, how to actually bring about capitalism through class struggle. So it basically gives us a path to socialism then. Organize the working class and wage class struggle. Eventually the workers can take power of the state apparatus and transition out of capitalism into socialism. So it puts socialism on this scientific basis by giving us this scientific understanding of capitalism, this materialist understanding of capitalism, and therefore, you know, we see that the class antagonism in capitalism, the class conflict, is between the working class and the capitalist class. You know, one class works, does all the labor, and they have their value extracted by the capitalists. And the class who does all the labor lives in degradation and relative poverty, while the capitalist who performs no labor lives in mass wealth. And the more that the capitalist can drive down the wages of his workers, the more wealth he can take home, because the less money he has to pay them from the total money that he's making from the commodities that the workers produce. So when you look at that, you see that the contradiction, the class struggle, is between the workers and capitalists. So the key then to building socialism is organizing those workers. Putting socialism on a scientific basis and giving us a path, a clear, direct path to actually achieving political power and achieving socialism. Although every path is going to look different, right, in every country, and every country has its own unique material conditions. And every country is going to have its own unique struggle, which looks different from those of other countries. But with the capitalist mode of production, with capitalist relations of production, which spread themselves and which exist globally, the main class antagonism is always going to be between the working class and the capitalist class, the workers and owners. And that's the beauty of Marxism. And this is what Vaush says he believes, right? The Vaush calls himself a dialectical and historical materialist. So he claims to believe in that, but you're going to see here, as he's talking about his path to build socialism, he doesn't actually use that lens of analysis. And he also makes fun of people who read theory and who read Marx. So there's also that.
All right? And we're going to do it using paint. But before we get to the paint, I need to talk about something very important to you, okay? Why do I want to be a socialist? Okay, so on a very, very fundamental level, I get called a lot of things: socialist, market socialist, libertarian, socialist, leftist, anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist, mutualist. There are a lot of things that I get called. Broadly speaking, here are my opinions. Okay, the progress of history is slow. You know, imagine we live in like a slave state, like Egypt. You know, back in 2000 BC or something like that. If I lived in such a society, do you think if I was intelligent enough to know what socialism was, I could meaningfully advocate for its implementation right then and there? Probably not. Because if we agree, generally speaking, with historical materialism, the idea is that the material relationships of society advance to a point where we can then make meaningful progress. Marx.
Sorry, this isn't the worst explanation of historical materialism, but it's more complex than that, because Marx's idea of communism and this idea that you could have a society without a state, you know, and without class, and without a strict division of labor by economic class, he discovered that by looking at indigenous communities, right, and looking at indigenous societies who him and Engels labeled as primitive communism, right? So basically, you can have the same relations of production. You can create the socialist communist society, but what capitalism does is it increases the productive forces an incredible amount, meaning it increases the amount of material wealth that human societies have. So that creates the possibility then for creating a communist society, a socialist society, like the indigenous communities who had a division of labor based on, you know, what people needed and protecting the community, plus all the wealth that's been created by capitalism and advancement in human technology and in science and in human production. And those things can be harnessed by society and used for the good of society once we transition to socialism. So yes, the productive forces do need to increase to a certain level, right? So humans control over nature and the productivity of labor, how much machines allow our labor to produce. That does increase with time, and that is part of what creates the possibility for communism as Marx and Engels imagined it. But it's not like you couldn't have thought of this idea back during Egypt, which, you know, in looking at their slave economy, I guess you probably still could, but I don't know. What Marx is looking at is the specific relations of production under capitalism, and the development of productive forces as it exists under capitalism. So Marx's form of socialism could only grow out of capitalism. It couldn't grow out of a slave state. So Vaush is correct on that, and he's also correct about how historical materialism talks about how the productive forces increase and the amount of material wealth in human societies increases with time. So not the worst explanation of historical materialism there from our boy.
Agreed that socialism was a necessary step in moving society forward. And I agree with him on that, because I think that socialism did a pretty excellent job of codifying the development of a modern industrial economy, which socialism can then take advantage of. Now, even if you don't agree generally with those ideas, even if that is the case, the fact remains nonetheless that, like, you can't.
And by the way, all the countries that Vaush hates, right, all these red, brown, tanky, authoritarian states like China, who Vaush cries about all the time and does propaganda against all the time, these are countries who had socialist revolutions before capitalism had come to their country and before they had industrialized, right? So what we were just talking about there, Marx was living in Europe, looking at the Industrial Revolution and capitalism developing in Europe and the relations of production there. When Mao or when Lenin got Marx, they looked at their own societies and realized the relations of production were different. The development of the productive forces was different than what it was in Europe. Mainly, they were still agrarian. They were still partially capitalist, but mostly peasant societies, right? So they had to organize these peasants against the feudal landlords. Then, once they took power, they had to increase their productive forces without capitalism. Right? The US and the UK increased their productive forces and developed capitalism through brutal exploitation and through the southern slave plantations, which produced mass amounts of cotton for the emerging capitalist markets in Europe and the US. China and the Soviet Union did not have that. They did not have that development, so they had to find ways to industrialize, to learn how to produce steel, to transform themselves into a modern economy, to even create the possibility for socialism, all while combating the U.S. empire. So they're doing this trying to bring themselves out of poverty so they can theoretically create socialism, and the U.S. is constantly trying to destroy them. Right, so Vaush, understanding that countries need to increase their productive forces before they can create socialism, should have a much less chauvinistic, much less imperialistic view of China than what he does.
Just wait. Did I not say? Did I say? What did I say? Whatever I said, I mean capitalism. My bad. I said socialism when I meant liberalism. Capitalism. My apologies. Socialism will overtake socialism. Well, that might happen too. Yeah. Non-stop warfare, comrades. Marx believed that capitalism had a purpose to serve, and I think I generally agree with that. I would also agree that feudalism was a necessary step in removing power away from like the divine right of absolute monarchs, and the divine right of absolute monarchs were probably a superior system to like theological confederacies or like the Roman Empire maybe. Like there's a progression over time with history, and it's all very.
Yes, but the progression over history with time doesn't work like that. So he said feudalism was a necessary step, right? And that's not anything Marx ever said. Marx recognized that there was feudalism in Europe, but if you look at the United States of America, they never had feudalism. We never had feudalism in this country. We never had monarchs or kings who ruled everything. You had the indigenous populations who had their own mode of production, and then Europeans came over and genocided them and brought with them capitalism and also slavery. Then the Civil War happened and all of the U.S. became capitalist. The mode of production changed to capitalist. But it was founded on slavery and capitalism. There was never a feudalist mode of production. The American Revolution was just against the British, but that doesn't mean there was ever, like feudal lords who ruled the U.S. We were founded as a bourgeois, as a capitalist society. And Marx was clear about this, right? He doesn't believe in some sort of unilateral view of history. It's not like, humans were in primitive communist societies, then they all moved at once to slave societies, then they all moved to feudalism, then capitalism, then socialism, right? Every country looks different, every country's development looks different, and America went from a mode of production based on the indigenous societies to a mode of production based on what the European colonizers want. They were founded as a bourgeois capitalist society who never underwent this stage of feudalism. So that's a mistake a lot of people make. I'm not necessarily criticizing Vaush for saying feudalism was a necessary step. I mean, that's wrong, I guess, but I don't know, that's a mistake a lot of people make.
Very complicated, and I'm not a fucking historian, so I'm not going to focus on that. I want to focus on today. Right now, today, we live in a capitalist society, a laissez-faire capitalist society, which means that, generally speaking, our economic system is oriented around the idea that any individual can.
Sorry, he said I'm not a historian, but I want to talk about today. But understanding today means it's necessary to understand history, because today is the product of years of historical development. So you can't understand today without understanding history, but nitpick.
Acquire capital privately, so money that they can use to turn into more money, to turn into more, capital, and that this can be done. Anyone can do this. That's unique. It didn't used to be that case, Back in the feudal days, not anyone could just become a successful businessman. And even if you did become successful, you were usually made subservient. Libraven, it's called laissez-faire capitalism as opposed to mercantile capitalism. It doesn't mean that it's literally laissez-faire with no restrictions whatsoever in the market. It's a juxtaposition to the former system of capitalism. Mercantile capitalism meant that there was more of a union, like an orientation between the relationship between merchants and the state, or I guess back then it would be like the monarchy.
And that merchant class is what eventually became the bourgeoisie, largely, the capitalist class. You also had, like, guild masters, right? So there were, like, guilds. You would have, one guild would make, like, shoes, and only the people in that guild would know how to make shoes then. They would keep their secrets so nobody else could steal their jobs. And then there was, like, a guild master, and he had apprentices. So the guild masters in some ways became capitalists, but mostly it was the merchants. So as trade was increasing, as commerce was increasing, the merchants were gaining more and more power and taking a bigger role in society. And eventually they became a class that was more powerful politically and economically than the feudal lords, than the aristocracy. And you have all these events like the French Revolution, and the bourgeois class is allowed to emerge. You also have like Simon Bolivar's revolution in Latin America, which was a revolution of the merchant class and of the capitalist class, the Creoles, in Latin America at the time. So that was the class in Europe and largely in Latin America who eventually overthrew the feudal monarchy, or in the case of Latin America, the European colonizers. So that, yeah, mercantile capitalism that he's talking about basically grew into the capitalism that we have today, modern neoliberalism.
And I don't like this system very much. I think it's kind of cringe, basically. The main problem that I have with capitalism is that it's not democratic and that it creates inequality. Those are my main issues. Now, when I say it's not democratic, what I mean by that are two fundamental things. One, the existence of people with more capital than others means that our political, electoral, democratic system is going to be made subservient to the interests of some people more so than the interests of other people. I.e., if you
So there's a problem there. He says his issues with capitalism are that it's undemocratic, and that it's like, so it's authoritarian, that it's unequal. It creates, mass inequality, which is true. Those are things that happen under capitalism. Those are terrible parts of capitalism. The workplace is authoritarian. The capitalists control the state apparatus, and the police, the military, these authoritarian bodies, and they use it to do imperialism and whatever else they want. And it's massively unequal. But this happens because capitalist production is the production of surplus value. Like we were talking about earlier, there's this core contradiction at the heart of capitalism, where the working class's interests are diametrically opposed with the capitalist class's interests. And actually, the workers are producing not to produce commodities which are useful to society. They have to be useful to society in order to be sold. But the main purpose of production is to accumulate more surplus value for the capitalist. So the capitalist doesn't pay workers wages and doesn't pay for means of production so he can make commodities which are super useful. He makes commodities so he can sell them. So he can make a profit, and then he can take the money that he made as profit and reinvest it in expanding his production and also keep some for himself. So this accumulation of capital, which is a core contradiction at the heart of the system, is what leads to this massive inequality. Right, so what needs to be attacked is this core contradiction, and that needs to be attacked through working class struggle against the capitalist class. You need to go directly to the contradiction at the heart of production, the relations of production, which put the capitalist class in complete control over the working class, and then engage in production for the production of surplus value, not the production of use values. So what Vaush is saying is true, but he's talking more about the effects of capitalism, right? The effects that we all know come out of capitalism. What Marx does is open up the hood of capitalism, right? He opens up the hood and says, this is the inner mechanism of capitalism. This is how capitalism operates. And these core contradictions at the heart of production, this contradiction between worker and capitalist that we all experience every time we go to work, is the contradiction which leads to things like authoritarianism and which leads to things like wealth inequality, because it necessitates the accumulation of capital for one class at the expense of another class. It's just social democrats, or liberals is what I guess I would call Vaush, are often focused on the results of capitalism, right? The most obvious things that you can see in capitalism that are bad, like it's unequal. But what Marx is focused on is the inner workings, right? The inner mechanisms, the relations of production that leads to these things. What leads to these things? What is the root cause of inequality and capitalist control of the government? So that's why theory is important, and that's why Vaush should stop telling people not to read theory, because they're going to end up being dumb like him.
you're super wealthy and you can create super PACs and you can create like lobbying groups and you can represent your interests in Washington, you're probably going to have more of an influence on the political sphere than an average Joe working at a fucking, Starbucks in Chicago. Probably, generally speaking. And the second reason I say it's undemocratic is because workplaces are authoritarian. They are. Like, really think about it. We live in a democratic society. Democracy works great for our electoral system. I mean, it's preferable to the alternative, at least. But with workplaces, they're pretty authoritarian. I mean, they literally are. You can be fired for any reason. You don't get a say in the rules of that workplace. You don't really get a say in how your labor is expressed and oriented. These are all, like, really, really, really severe problems to me. I think they hurt people. I think it fucking sucks that most people will spend their entire lives utterly dependent on an authoritarian system to survive. I think it sucks that the average person will never have as much influence into the broader political system as small groups of, corporate hegemonies and business people and investors and capital owners and stuff. That bothers me.
It's a really good point. I agree with everything he said about the authoritarian nature of the workplace. And it's so true, people only focus on political authoritarianism, right? They only focus on state crackdowns on, or state abuses of human rights, which is fair. We should definitely criticize those things and be wary of them. But nobody ever talks about authoritarianism in the workplace, right? Nobody ever talks about the way that everybody's workplace, where they spend like 80% of their life, is a top-down dictatorship where you have to do whatever the capitalist says because he owns the means of production. And if you don't sell your labor to a capitalist, you starve to death and die. That's your only option. So your only option is to sell your labor into this top-down authoritarian workplace. It's super, it's laughable that people accuse socialism of being authoritarian when this is the fucking system that we have and that we operate in within every day. The only small, tiny little thing I would disagree with Vosh there is he said, this is what bothers me. Right, and he's talking about his own path to socialism, right? But he's saying, this is what bothers me, so therefore I'm a socialist and I want socialism because I don't want people to be bossed around in the workplace. It's like, okay, but for Marx, from the perspective of dialectical materialism, it doesn't really matter that bugs you, right? That makes you want to be a socialist. What Marx is saying is that this relationship, this dictatorial authoritarian relationship in the workplace, is the class struggle, the class antagonism, which is going to lead to the creation of a new society if you look at society scientifically, right? So if you look at the proletarian class and what they do at work every single day and the way they're oppressed at work every single day, they all the workers have the impulse to overthrow the capitalist class, right? It's in every single worker's interest to do this. And that is what makes class struggle so important, right? And that is what leads to the creation of new societies, like the peasant societies, or the peasants in the French Revolution. They weren't getting enough food, right? They were the ones producing all the food, but the aristocracy, the aristocrats who owned the land, and the church who owned the land were hoarding all the wealth, and people were starving. So it eventually became in all their interest to overthrow this oppressive class and create a new society. Same thing will happen with capitalism. So, regardless of what we think about the workplace morally, regardless of what our own morality tells us about it, is sort of irrelevant because the class antagonism exists. Because for the working class who sell their labor to a capitalist and go to work every day, that contradiction makes itself apparent every day, which leads to sentiments of class struggle, which is ultimately going to lead to, again, class struggle leading to the creation of a new society. So yeah, I always just like to focus things on classes rather than individuals as much as possible. Sometimes you got to focus on individuals, but when we're talking about Marxism, it's supposed to be a scientific analysis where we're looking at the actions and the impulses of different classes, not the morality of the workplace. That's something we can point out. We can definitely point out how the workplace is immoral, right? But Marxism is the scientific understanding that there are class antagonisms within every society and identifying that class antagonism within capitalism by looking at the workplace. All right, that was probably rambling for too long. Let's move on here.
Now, my preferred system is not one which is oriented around hatred for any group. Not landlords, not cops, not rich people. All of these groups of people have the capacity individually to be good, hardworking, upstanding, moral people. But it remains a fact nonetheless that these people are complicit in maintaining the existence of this system.
So that was good. Right there, he basically said what I said, right? Like, you can't look at the individuals. You have to look at the classes, the class makeup, especially when you're talking about armed bodies of the state, as Lenin would call them, meaning like the police and the military. So the idea is the capitalist class controls the state, and then there are these armed bodies of the state like the police, who the capitalist class can use to suppress the working class and can use to keep them in line. And yeah, when we critique this system, it's not to say that every single cop is immoral. Again, not making just a personal moralistic judgment on it, but we're looking at what these armed bodies do, how they operate as a class, as a whole, within society, within the totality of society. And that's why it's a scientific analysis, not a moralistic analysis of the individuals who work these jobs.
I would go as far as to say, I would run this back. I don't think that every slave owner back in the 19th century would have individually been a bad person. I think that people's moral systems are largely molded by the world that they were born into. I think that the goal should always be to challenge the system and not to challenge the individual. To challenge the individual is exclusionary. To challenge the individual is reductive. But to challenge the system, which we should be doing as intersectional leftists,
He went really far with the idea of not making a moralistic judgment, but like I said, I think I would disagree with that. Because I think you can still make the moralistic judgment, right? It's just less important than the materialist scientific analysis. So like slavery, right? You look at American slave society, the main contradiction was between the slaves, of course, and the slave owners. But then you also had a class of white wage laborers who were living in massive poverty in the area and who wanted slavery to end. And then you also had capitalists in the North, this economic class, who were against the slave owners and the slave-owning oligarchy in the South. Because they wanted more wealth, power, and control for themselves, because capitalism has to constantly expand. So they kept running into antagonisms with the slave owners in the South, which ultimately led to the Civil War. But you could still look at those slave owners and say they're immoral, right? They still owned slaves. They still tortured people in order to make a profit, right? So yes, they arose because of the material conditions of the day. Like, yes, those slave owners only became slave owners because slavery was the mode of production at the time they existed, and they were born into a slave-owning family, and that was their material conditions. But it's still fucking immoral. John Brown is still a good guy for attacking a bunch of Southern slave owners for not wanting to end slavery, because these were people who were doing everything they could to control the government to make sure that they still owned slaves. They were doing everything they could to push these ideas of like scientific racism, in order to justify slavery. They did, in all these things, yes, from a personal, individualistic standpoint, they are immoral, even though this system was a product of the material conditions of the time. So I guess I know I just critiqued him from coming at things from a moralistic standpoint, but then he goes, I don't even think slave owners are immoral. It's like, well, that's not what don't go that far. Like, what, just because we're products of our material conditions doesn't mean that we can't have any kind of morality. But I don't know. Kind of a ramble again, I guess. Moving on.
Is what does genuine work. So then we ask, how do we make society better? Well, this is my goal. The first thing, and there is a three-way movement that we have to shore up on all fronts. The first two are, at least for now, more important than the last one. The first one is the culture war, baby. This is what I do.
Not the class struggle. The class struggle is not the most important part about bringing about socialism. For Vaush, it's the culture war. Right? It's changing our culture so it's more socialistic. It's not about material relations of production. It's not about classes of people who arise historically, classes which arise based on their relation to the means of production, and a struggle over the means of production which moves history. That's not the most important part. It's the culture war. It's not the culture which is shaped by the material basis of society and also conditions the material basis of society, and they have a dialectical relationship like that. Nope, culture war, number one most important. Only way to win the culture war is to stream on Twitch. The only one who will actually have a chance to bring about socialism are Vaush and Destiny and other Twitch streamers. Not the proletariat.
At the end of the day, political power is built by numbers. That's it. Support and public popularity are the bedrock of all populist movements, and we are a populist movement. Unless you want to do some weird, like, secretly become head of the CIA and launch a military coup for leftism kind of thing, which historically tends not to be how leftism is implemented in the real world. Our goals...
That's happened before. That happened in, like, Peru. In, like, in 1979, there was, like, a military dictator, U.S.-backed, and then this other section of the military, like, took power, and they basically started moving towards, like, socialism. They tried to enact, like, this super progressive constitution and do all these land reform policies, and the U.S. eventually deposed them and overthrew them. But it's kind of crazy, and Venezuela was almost similar. You had Hugo Chavez lead this socialist coup attempt in 1992, which failed, but then he would come back in 1998 and win election, and he was part of the armed forces. That was how that happened, so... There have been times where, like, sections of the military, like, take control of a state and they try and move, like, more left or towards a more socialistic kind of society. So that's a random tangent, but I just thought it was interesting that he said that, someone should become head of the CIA and implement leftism in the U.S. I guess. If anyone wants to do that and it actually works in bringing about socialism, I'm all for it.
Are to push people towards values that will make them more receptive to our political goals. So, here are some examples of things that we do to win the culture war. I'm about to list a lot of stuff, or at least I could. Changing people's minds individually in person, debating people on Discord to try and get your views out there, making YouTube channels to disseminate information to people who want to find better criticisms of conservative values, debating conservatives, pushing values like, say, for example, solidarity, camaraderie, trans rights, anti-white supremacy, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and all other forms of progressive values generally into the broader public, petitioning these values to politicians, trying to get these values normalized in public discourse and in media, producing media that normalizes these values. Hey, has anyone seen the season finale of She-Ra? Normalize.
So what can you do to bring about socialism? Debate conservatives on Twitch, right? Debate people on Discord. Make a YouTube channel and talk about leftism. So everything that Vaush does. So his argument for how to bring about socialism is basically just, everything I'm doing is good. Everything that I do is bringing about socialism. Debating conservatives on Discord is bringing about socialism. And versus, compare that to what I say when people ask me, how do we actually build socialism? I give you two concrete things that I say again and again and again. Organize workplaces, unionize and organize the workers at work where, at the place of production where surplus value is produced for the capitalist. Organize people there so you can wage a struggle directly against the capitalists. And then organize your communities, right? Organize book clubs, learning theory, organize mutual aid groups to bring people food. So the Communist Party is strong and organized so that people know when my boss fails me, right? When my boss doesn't give me enough money to get by or enough food to get by, and when the government fails me, the Communist Party is there for me, right? The Communist Party has these mutual aid groups that come to me, and that's how you win people over to your side politically, and that's how you get them engaged in the economic class struggle. So you have economic organizing and community organizing, all with the goal of organizing the masses, organizing the working class, organizing the material class who is exploited whose labor is exploited every day because of their relation to the means of production, because they don't own the means of production, so therefore they have to sell their labor to a capitalist to survive, right? Organizing that class, which exists all around us and which most of us are within. Versus Voosh, he's like, debate conservatives, make a YouTube channel, win the culture war, push ideas that I'm in favor of. It's like, no, organize workers. You are not the revolutionary agent of capitalist society. The working class is, right? So Marx says that the proletariat is the revolutionary agent of society. They are the class that is exploited, but they're fairly organized and they have class consciousness due to the fact that they go to work together and work every day, and the proletarians have their own sort of culture. And this is the revolutionary agent of capitalist society who can wage a class struggle and overthrow it. Vaush is like, no. I am the revolutionary agent of capitalist society. I will go on Twitch, I will debate conservatives on Discord, and I'll convince everybody to do socialism. It's like, that's not going to do anything. I mean, it does some things, right? Twitch is, and social media are they're tools to reach people, right? But unless you get people materially organized at the point of production in the workplace and in our communities, we're not going to be able to do anything. So that needs to be the goal, not winning some sort of abstract culture war that Voosh imagined in his head.
Normalizing these values by pushing them in every media space imaginable, up to and including TV, movies, and what have you. Doing everything that you can to make sure that people are aware of the fact that there are alternatives to the pre-existing systemic hegemony. In person, we have direct action. We have working and volunteering. We have people who can engage in real life to convince people that the systems that they work within are not effective. You can create nonprofits. You can work in nonprofits. Everything.
How does working at a nonprofit or creating a nonprofit bring about socialism? I worked at a nonprofit. It was a nursing home, and I worked as a COVID tester. I COVID tested every employee, and I also worked in the gym, the place where the old people would work out. And all they do is underpay the shit out of their employees, and then at the end of every month, they'll ask their employees for more money. So they'll pay you like $11 an hour was what I got paid, and then at the end of every month, they're like, donate to us. We're a nonprofit. And then, you don't have like a capitalist making a bunch of surplus value, and so it's, nonprofits are a little bit better, but then you do have this like managerial administrative class who basically then exploits the workers, and so it ends up functioning very similarly. Nonprofits within capitalism end up functioning, very similar to capitalist organizations, of course. So how is that going to bring about socialism? It's not. Don't join a nonprofit if you want to bring about socialism. Join the Communist Party. Promise.
Everything that you can do to convince people that our values are good and their values are not is building this. And you know this for a fact. We just talked to Chris Ray Gun. When Chris Ray Gun did his little videos, guys, I don't care what Sargon is saying or doing unless...
But even if all the culture was changed, like, what would that affect? I'm assuming he just thinks if we change the culture enough, all of a sudden left-wingers are just going to win every election. But I really don't get how he imagines in his head that we'll just convince everybody that socialism is better and that will somehow lead to bringing about socialism. We'll see what he says here. Maybe he expands on this idea. Because the culture war is this abstract thing, right? Like, organizing the working class is a material thing. It's a concrete thing. You can imagine how to do it. You can explain, what worker organization looks like, right? Like stronger unions, which act as an organ of class power and fights for better benefits and stuff for workers. That's a concrete organization of workers which can work to do class struggle and bring about socialism. The culture war, this circle that Vaush drew on MS Paint, is just this abstract idea that somehow we gotta win this and then socialism will come. Like, this is idealism. This is absolute idealism, which Marx railed against, and which dialectical materialism destroys. Yeah.
He's up to debate, okay? I genuinely don't care. He's a coward. He'll shit talk from behind a wall all he wants. I genuinely do not care. We talked about the Chris Ray Gun videos when we talked with Chris Ray Gun. How many people do you think Chris Ray Gun red-pilled on anti-SJWism with his silly little music videos? How many people do you think he got over? 100,000? 200,000? A million people, possibly? Probably a lot of fucking people. Probably a fuck ton of people. Too many people, perhaps? Now, with that being the case, we have to recognize that a lot of the people who enjoyed the stuff that Chris Ray Gun produced, or that Sargon of Akkad produces, funnily enough, or any of these more reactionary content creators produce, pushes people towards political systems and political beliefs that normalizes the implementation of their actual policy positions.
So this is why I think this video is hilarious. This video makes me laugh, or the first time I saw it made me laugh so hard. Because it shows how Vaush's ego so thoroughly controls and affects his thinking, right? So he thinks the whole political battle in this country, the whole class struggle in this country, the battle for socialism and for politics, is taking place between Twitch streamers, right? He's like, oh, so, here's me over here pushing left-wing values, and then over there on the right you have Chris Ray Gun and Sargon of Akkad, and it's just a battle for us, between us for the heart of America. Like, no! It is a battle between workers who are going to work every single day. The working class who are exploited every single day, and the capitalists. It is a class struggle and a class antagonism between them. There's not some abstract culture war being fought between Vaush and Chris Ray Gun, of which the winner will get to see their ideal system created. That is the most ridiculous shit I've ever heard. Like, yes, convincing people to join your political side is important so that then they can take action, right? But it's not like there's this battle between Vaush and Sargon of Akkad, and whoever, whether if we have a left-wing government and presidency, that means Vaush is winning. And if we have right-wing, that means Sargon of Akkad is winning, right? This is absurd, but it shows how Vaush looks at things, right? It shows this egotistical view of socialism he has where he's the revolutionary agent. Like I said, it's not the working class that will bring about socialism through their organization and class struggle. It's me who will bring about socialism by streaming on Twitch and debating conservatives on Discord. And all the while distracting, his giant audience from what would actually bring about socialism, right? From community and economic organizing.
That's the main issue. The main issue isn't that if we have like anti-SJWs on YouTube, they'll be mean to people. The main issue is that anti-SJWs will usually have their views normalized through the political space. Like, say, for example, voting for Trump, or say, for example, opposing the C-16 bill in Canada, or say, for example, voting in local conservative representatives for Congress and for Senate and for the gubernatorial seat and all that stuff. That's the main issue. Usually when I focus on these like cultural, like, oh, let's discuss this stuff, it's not just for harm reduction in the sense that I want to make YouTube less shitty. I mean, that's nice, The main issue is that people who are made less shitty also vote differently than people who are more shitty. And that's the real problem. The right has done an extraordinarily good job advancing cultural conditions to bring people over into voting for conservative policies. It's very easy to do this for the right. Think about George Bush. Think about George Bush's approval rating immediately after 9/11. Stuff like being attacked, stuff like an immigrant wave, stuff like a war being started, stuff like posturing. All of these things can get conservatives huge amounts of public support that will then lead into them being voted into power and then voted into power again afterwards. And that's a problem. So when we work towards normalizing political positions that are amicable to us, we're doing so in the eventual hope that we're able to get these positions pushed forward in actual spaces of power where it really matters.
So the whole goal is to control people so they vote better, right? So they vote for progressive candidates and not for these right-wing conservative candidates like Trump. Okay, so the goal is to get people to not vote for Trump, Vaush. Who ran against Trump? Joe Biden, the corporatist Democrat who helped write the crime bill, who voted for the Iraq War, who serves big pharma and these multinational corporations and the capitalist class. So how does convincing people to vote for that guy lead to socialism, Vaush? Because I thought you were talking about what leads to socialism. But now you're saying there's a battle between Twitch streamers, which affects how people vote, and if you get people not to vote for Trump, that's going to lead to left-wing politics and socialism. Joe Biden hasn't done anything for the working class. He has done nothing to strengthen the working class's power in the class struggle against the capitalist class. And this was created in 2020, but now after 2 years of Joe Biden, we've seen that, what all the socialists predicted was that he was a bourgeois, capitalist, a political candidate who lied to the Bernie supporters so he could get elected, so that they would vote for him instead of Trump. Nothing about that is going to bring about socialism. Or even if we would have gotten Bernie Sanders in, sure, he would have been better than Biden, but there's no way that he would have been able to bring about socialism. Only class struggle can do that. And also, I want to show this. We talk about base and superstructure a lot, which is basically, Marx never says base and superstructure, but this is an analytical tool for understanding dialectical materialism. So here's how Marx looks at society. You have the base, which is the production and reproduction of life. So basically economics, how humans interact with their environment using human labor. That is the base of society because every society operates around human labor and organizes human labor in a certain way with certain relations. So you have the means of production, tools, machines, factories, land, raw materials, relations of production like the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And that is the base, right? The economic conditions of society. The superstructure is the law, media, politics, science, education. So the superstructure shapes and maintains the base, but it also emerges out of the base, right? The base allows for the superstructure to be created, and then the superstructure reflects and helps to maintain the base. So when you look at politics, right, Joe Biden is an example of American politics, the American superstructure. Joe Biden emerged out of the capitalist class, out of the corporatists. All of the Democratic candidates, when it looked like Bernie Sanders might win, dropped out of the election and endorsed Joe Biden on the same day. Right? That's the politics shaping and maintaining the base. Now, while Joe Biden's in office, he continues to maintain the base by going ahead with politics which are in service of the capitalist class. So the base, the capitalist worker relationship, then conditions the superstructure. Right? And the idea is that class struggle needs to be waged at the base, that workers need to get organized at the base so that they can attack the politics, so that they can control the state and political apparatus. But what comes first is the base. What comes first is class struggle. Compare the analytical tool of base and superstructure to this shit that Voosh drew in MS Paint. So rather than seeing, a class struggle between the working class and the capitalist class taking place at the base, which then leads to changes and changes in form of the superstructure, of the political, and of media, and of culture, and things like that. Instead, we just have this circle that represents culture, and then we have Vaush. Vaush on one side, Sargon of Akkad on the other, and they're both fighting for the heart of America, right? And whoever wins this circle, this culture circle that Vaush drew, they win the politics too, right? So it's not that there's a base economic relations of production which create politics, and class struggle in that base can lead to changes in politics, that's stupid. That's really dumb. This is dialectical materialism. There's actually a circle that represents the culture, and then Vaush can change it, and then that will lead to socialism. Like, dude, how do you call yourself a dialectical materialist and then draw this shit and say this is your path to socialism? At least draw something that looks like class struggle. At least draw something that shows the relations of production, the class antagonism between workers and capitalists. Don't just draw a circle that represents everyone and say you're going to convince them all to join socialism so they vote for Joe Biden and then we have a left-wing government. This is the most incoherent thing I've ever heard. And it is an absolute distortion of dialectical and historical materialism.
So let's talk about that. Here is what I would like to see. Leftism is not going to win the presidency. If Bernie Sanders had become president, even if he had become president, and it's not happening now, guys, I'm really sorry, but even if he had become president, he would not have been able to do that much on his own. The main reason for that is because he would have been limited to executive actions for imposing his will on the country. Now, you can do a lot with an executive action. Apparently these days, you can more or less declare war with it, since nobody respects the fact that Congress needs to approve a war anymore. That just seems to be something we've skipped by. But because the House and because the Senate were not amicable to his political positions, there was just no way he could have meaningfully changed things to the extent we would have liked. And frankly, I don't really want to implement leftist policies in this country through fucking executive action. Is that really the way we want to do it? No, I'm not.
That is so revealing. That right there is so revealing. I don't know if we want to enact leftist policy through executive action, because it might be too authoritarian in my head. Like, dude, in a year and a half, I'm going to be off my parents' health care. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to go to the doctor anymore when I get sick. I don't give a shit if we get Medicare for all through executive action. You think I'm going to complain about that and be like, oh, that's authoritarian. Oh, no, don't tell the insurance companies what to do. It's authoritarian. I don't give a shit. I want health care. Because I'm actually in the working class, unlike Voosh, who grew up in Beverly Hills and now makes tons and tons of money Twitch streaming. So what's more important for him is not being authoritarian, right? This abstract, idealist idea that he has in his head of authoritarianism that we have to avoid. Like, motherfucker, I don't care. I want healthcare for the working class because I don't want to die, right? And that is what Marx realized, was that the working class all has impulse. They all have incentive to take control of the state. So it doesn't necessarily matter how they get there, because the bourgeoisie is going to violently suppress them no matter how the workers try and take power. So it doesn't really matter how they get there as long as the workers do take power, so that they can end this contradictory, horrific system of capitalism and bring about socialism. Versus Voosh won't even give people healthcare through executive action because it's too authoritarian. Like, yeah, easy for you to say. I'm sure you have healthcare. I'm sure Twitch, your Twitch subscribers, or maybe the money from your parents, I don't know, pays for your healthcare. But not all of us have that. I mean, that is an absolutely insane thing to say. I really, even for Voosh, that was bad. Oh, I don't want to do leftist policies through executive action. That's scary. Dude, I need healthcare. Fuck you.
I'm not saying I didn't want Bernie to win. Of course I did, but we have to recognize the dude would have been working with a handicap. But doing this through executive action, just the president unilaterally doing this stuff, it's a bad precedent. And the next president can just undo it. Anything you do via executive action can just be undone via executive action. Whereas if you...
That part's actually pretty true. Unless, there are some permanent things that can be implemented through executive action, but that's the main problem, right? Is like, I agree with him that if Bernie became president, we wouldn't have actually seen that many left-wing policies, and that he would have been very, very, very handicapped in what he would have been allowed to do. He probably would have done executive actions to try and get left-wing policies across, which I would have fully supported and agreed with, but he would have been very limited in what he was actually able to bring about.
Have it pushed through House and Congress and so on and so forth, it is much, much harder to undo that stuff. Much harder. That's why the Republicans weren't able to repeal the entirety of Obamacare, because that was actually pushed through. It wasn't done via executive order. They were only able to get rid of the individual mandate. Courts can undo it also. Yeah, like executive action is just not that useful. long term. Not a great way of establishing long-term political changes. So here's what we need to focus on, guys. And I believe in this very, very firmly. We need to go local. Remember that, okay? All the power, all the obfuscation Republicans are able to engage in Congress and in the Senate comes from the fact that they have local representatives who are there, who are able to contribute to the, frankly, current immovability of the Senate.
So he basically goes on to argue that we need to vote for state and local candidates, right? If we vote for people at the local level, that will eventually lead to gaining power at the national level, which is better. It's better than the culture war circle that he drew, right? But it's still hyper-focused on elections. It's still hyper-focused on the political. So if I bring back up our base and superstructure here, all of Vauch's analysis and his entire path to building socialism is up here. It takes place up here in the superstructure. You know, I'm going to produce media on Twitch, which is going to change the culture, which is going to lead to changes in social institutions and lead to changes in politics. And that will bring about socialism, this new economic system. All his analysis is focused on the superstructure, where he needs to be focused on the base, right? We don't need to vote for more candidates in the state and local politics. State and local politics are still thoroughly controlled by corporations and by the capitalist class. We need to organize people at the point of production. We need to organize workers whose labor is exploited every day. We need to organize workplaces where the exploitation of workers actually goes down. We need to create unions and organs of working class power so that they can fight their boss at the level of the base, right? But then also, unions can gain political clout. And the more organized workers are, the more political clout they have. And then they can start to influence the superstructure. But it's organization at the base which leads to changes in the superstructure. And Vauch is completely inverting this, saying if we just vote for enough good candidates, it's going to lead to socialism. Like, well, that has not been working out well for us. You know, and in countries like Bolivia, right, or in countries like Venezuela, where they have gone ahead with this electoral path to socialism, where they haven't had, like, you know, strict, like, revolutions, like what we imagine the October Revolution that brought about the Soviet Union, or like we imagine the French or American revolutions, like, you know, uprisings of economic classes which overthrew and changed the political structure all sort of at once, right? You can have political revolutions which take power over time, and if you look at Venezuela and Bolivia, which Carlos and I have offered critiques of them, we do think they need to take more control of the state apparatus, but they've basically gone this electoral path, right? They've tried to do socialism through electoral politics. But that does not mean that they didn't start their organization at the base, right? They took power of the politics of the superstructure through elections, yes. But that only happened because of the level of organization that they had at the base, because of the level of unionization that they had, because of the level of outreach that the socialist parties were doing within the unions, because of the mutual aid and the other methods of community organizing that the Communist and Socialist Party members were doing in order to get people to vote communist. Massive organization went into creating socialist political revolutions in Bolivia and Venezuela at the grassroots level and at the point of production, at the workplace. Great example, when the U.S. did their coup of Bolivia, when the U.S. overthrew Evo Morales and replaced him with this far right-wing, anti-indigenous, fascist dictatorship who was killing people and was killing trade unionists, the major industries in Bolivia, the major unions all went on strike, right? So they said, if you're going to, you know, enforce this dictatorial political system and not allow us to build the kind of society we want, we're going to withhold our labor power, and we can do that because of how organized we are, right? And it shut the whole country's economy down, which gives the workers huge clout over the political system and economic system, and it gives them huge leeway and power, especially compared to, like, the U.S., where our 40 years of neoliberalism has systematically dismantled our unions, right? We need that organization at the base if we're going to be able to threaten any kind of political power. So that needs to be our focus, and that's the main issue with Vauch's video, is his focus is not there. He's entirely focused on the political, on the superstructure, and I think that theoretical misunderstanding and those non-Marxist principles are what leads Vauch to saying so much dumb